Hi, welcome back to the channel. 66 days. That's how long oil prices have been above $90 per barrel, and in fact, over that time, they've been above $100 for the vast majority of it. Right now, Brent crude is sitting at around $109 per barrel, and the really worrying thing is that nobody knows when this situation is going to end, because what started as a geopolitical crisis is now slowly turning into an economic war of attrition against the global economy itself. And unlike the initial panic phase of this conflict, what we're seeing now is something much slower, but potentially much more dangerous. A grinding, prolonged energy shock, a kind of slow-motion economic car crash. Now, before we get into the details on all of this, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscribe button? Really helps me with the algorithm, also puts a smile on my face. And if you don't want to miss any future updates, please also hit that notifications bell. Now let me take you back to where we were before all of this started. At the end of February, oil prices were sitting at around $70 per barrel. They'd increased from around $60 at the start of 2026. Inflation was slowly cooling. Markets were expecting interest rate cuts to come later this year. The IMF was actually becoming optimistic about global growth. There was a growing belief that the world economy had survived the inflation crisis of the last few years and was finally stabilising. Then everything changed. The war in Iran erupted. The Strait of Hormuz, which most of us probably weren't even aware of, is the single biggest important choke point in the world for oil and effectively became unstable overnight. And suddenly, the entire global energy system was thrown into crisis because around 20% of the world's oil supply would usually pass through that narrow stretch of water every single day. 20%. And when markets realised that supply was under threat, prices exploded. Within weeks, oil had surged to $120 per barrel. That was one of the fastest oil spikes in modern history. Now, at first, a lot of investors believed that this was going to be a temporary situation. There was a feeling that diplomacy would calm things down quickly, that the conflict would remain contained, that oil supply disruptions would only last for a few days or maybe a couple of weeks. But that hasn't happened. Instead, we've entered a completely different phase of this crisis. And this is the really important point that I want to focus in today, because this is no longer a temporary oil spike. This is now becoming embedded into the global economy. And historically, this is when real damage starts, because this is not a demand shock. This is not the global economy consuming huge amounts of oil because it's growing at a rapid rate. This is a supply shock. There is a massive difference between the two. When oil rises because demand is strong, that usually happens because businesses are expanding, consumers are spending money, factories are busy, airlines are flying more, economies are growing. Basically, things are going well. But supply shocks are very different. Supply shocks act like a tax on the entire global economy. Suddenly, everything becomes expensive simultaneously. Fuel, electricity, food, transport, chemicals, packaging, manufacturing, air travel, shipping, fertilizer, basically every single part of modern life depends on oil in some form. And when prices stay elevated for a prolonged period of time, businesses eventually start passing those costs on to consumers. Then inflation rises. Then consumers cut their spending. Then growth slows and eventually something breaks. Now, what's interesting about the current situation is that despite this enormous disruption, the global system is still broadly functioning. And the reason it's still functioning is because governments, producers and energy companies are effectively holding the system together using their emergency buffers and reserves. Strategic reserves are being released, emergency stockpiles are being drawn down, countries are burning through stored fuel inventories, producers are trying to squeeze out every spare barrel they can, shipping routes are being adjusted, airlines are rerouting around conflict zones. All of this is effectively acting like a giant temporary support mechanism underneath the global economy. But here's the problem. Those buffers are not infinite. And this is where things could potentially become extremely dangerous later this year, because if the war drags on, if supply disruptions worsen, if reserves continue falling, or if another major producer becomes involved in this conflict, then markets could suddenly realise there is no longer enough spare capacity left in the system. And that's when oil markets can move violently higher, because oil trading is driven heavily by psychology. As long as traders believe there's enough oil somewhere in the system, prices remain relatively contained. But the moment markets begin thinking, what if there isn't enough supply left? That's when panic buying starts. That's when countries begin competing aggressively for cargoes. That's when hoarding begins. And historically, that's when oil prices can spiral out of control very quickly. Now, some analysts are already openly discussing scenarios involving $150 or even $200 oil if the conflict escalates further, or if reserves begin running critically low. And if that happened, the consequences for the global economy would be severe. Because unlike the 1970s, governments today are already massively indebted. Consumers are already under pressure, interest rates are already high, economic growth is already weak in many countries, so the world economy doesn't have much resilience left. And this is why historical comparisons are becoming increasingly important. Back in 1973, the Arab oil embargo triggered one of the worst energy crises in modern history. Oil prices quadrupled, the global economy entered recession, inflation exploded. Then, in 1979, the Iranian Revolution triggered another major oil shock. Again, recession followed. Then in 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, oil surged sharply higher, the US entered recession shortly afterwards. And then in 2008, oil prices surged towards $150 per barrel right before the global financial crisis, which is the biggest recession in modern history. Now, obviously, oil wasn't the only cause of those recessions, but prolonged supply-driven oil shocks have an incredibly strong historical record of damaging economic growth. And right now, we're already beginning to see the early signs of strain appearing everywhere. Airlines are under pressure, shipping costs are rising, retailers are warning about margins, bond markets are becoming nervous again, inflation expectations are rising, food prices are climbing in some regions, and central banks are trapped because if they cut interest rates to support growth, they risk making inflation even worse. But if they keep rates high to fight inflation, they risk crushing already weak economies. It's the exact same stagflation dilemma policymakers faced during the 1970s, and that period did not end well. Now, maybe oil stabilises around these levels and the world muddles through somehow. That's possible, but the longer this continues, the greater the risks become, because the damage from energy shocks is cumulative. It builds slowly, week after week, month after month, almost invisibly at first, until eventually the pressure becomes too much. And that's really where we are right now. Not at the beginning of the crisis anymore, but not at the end either. Instead, we're trapped in this strange middle phase where the global economy is still moving forward, but increasingly under stress, and nobody really knows where the breaking point is. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments, but hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you have liked what I've said, or maybe you didn't quite like it, but you thought it was interesting, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already.